And what began as a small project has morphed into this wonderful presentation by one of our board members, Dan Neumann. So it began as a script for Select Board member Andy Reardon in the back. He played John King Nash in the cemetery tour that we had this past fall. And then that kind of evolved into a fabulous newsletter article. And here today we have a presentation for everybody about the big split 175 years ago. So without further ado, Dan Neumann.
Thank you, Wendy. Thank you all for joining. We're here to celebrate the 175th birthday of Norwell. I looked it up, and the Latin word for 175th anniversary is demi-semi-centennial. Of course, that means one half of a 700-year period. So with that, I'd like to wish you all a very happy demi-semi-centennial. The big split happened in 1849 when our town separated from Scituate and became South Scituate. We were later renamed Norwell in 1888 when we were named after a town benefactor, Henry Norwell. Our border with Scituate starts here. Our border with Scituate starts here. That's where it's, what is the name of that place? It's Treeberry Farm on Main Street, and it jogs to this northwest sharp point here in Wampatuck State Park. That blue dot there is my house. I sit right on the border. So I guess you could say that's my sole qualification for this presentation today. But when I look at the resulting shape of Norwell, I do wonder if the folks in 1849 had anticipated creating a jellyfish. Some people think that they see a mushroom or a brain. I personally see a jellyfish. And South Scituate got slightly more land than Scituate in the split. But you can argue that South Scituate may have felt like they got the much better deal, because waterfront property really wasn't considered as valuable as it is today. To quote Joseph Foster Merritt, "The West rather looked askance at the long line of barren beach and wasteland, which they were very glad to be rid of." Speaking of boundaries, the Historical Society recently hosted a perambulation event. Perambulation essentially means beating the bounds, and it was an ancient tradition originating in England where town officials would periodically inspect local town border markers and then literally beat them with a stick. Occasionally, young boys would be beaten at the town marker so that they would never forget where that location was. Here we have Norwell Select Board member Andy Reardon and Scituate Select Board member Laura Curran beating the bounds. No one was harmed. And there are 12 markers outlining Norwell. An old map of the markers was recently discovered by one of our great volunteers, Judy Greco, in our archives. Then it was Carl Swenson, one of our board members, who actually went out into the woods and discovered all but one of the 12 markers and mapped them on GPS. We can forgive Carl because the last one is allegedly located underwater in Jacob's Pond, right, Carl? Carl's getting a call. But I'd like to thank Carl for his service as chief perambulator and friendly border czar for the town. So why did we separate from Scituate? That's the question I'd like to address tonight. Some have said that the seeds of discord were originally sown back in the 1600s with what I will refer to as the Reverend Chauncey affair. Charles Chauncey was a minister in Scituate. He was a minister of First Parish Church in Scituate, and he was adamant that baptism only be conducted by full immersion and that communion take place only after dark. So apparently this was far too, extreme for his parishioners, and they left that church and formed a new church on the west end of town, and they called that Second Parish Church of Scituate. And of course, when we separated from Scituate in 1849, it became First Parish Church of South Scituate, then becoming First Parish Church of Norwell, which we know today, standing at Town Common. And that building was constructed in 1830. Interestingly, Chauncey was later named or appointed president of Harvard, but only under one condition. He had to abandon his extremist, eccentric practices. He did so, and he got the job. Overall, though, there's no evidence that there's any connection between this affair and the split, which happened more than 200 years later. Surprisingly, there's really not a lot written about the reasons for the split. We do have a list of reasons that were offered in a petition that we think was dated around 1849. The reasons, though, are fairly mundane and unsatisfying. I'll go through them relatively quickly. First, the inhabitants are nearly unanimous in favor of division. Well, that's not really a reason. I mean, stating that it's unanimous doesn't necessarily get at the root cause. Second, there is territory and inhabitants sufficient for 2 towns. Okay, well, just because you have the space and the people doesn't necessarily mean that you should do it. Third, a large amount of time will be saved to attend town meetings. That's actually reasonable. For the folks that lived at the edge of town, it was a 7-mile journey to get to town meeting. So that was a full day affair back then, especially if you were a farmer. It was a really big ask. So attendance at town meetings did suffer, and people were not feeling adequately represented by their town government. Fourth, the interests and callings of the 2 sections are somewhat different. True, the folks in the east end of town did lean more maritime, and the folks in the west end lean more agricultural. And fifth, the division would promote the cause of education and improve the public schools. So back then, there were actually 21 school districts in Scituate, and the uncertainty around the big split caused a delay in the investment in those districts. So the question that people were asking was, why should I invest in this district today if it may not be my district tomorrow? The real catalyst was financial. It was related to national and international events happening at that time. It began with President Andrew Jackson's policies. He was a populist president who distrusted the National Bank. He felt that the National Bank was run by elitists, and that those elitists didn't have the interests of the so-called common man at heart. So he eliminates the National Bank. Then, at the end of his term, the federal government ran a budget surplus, something that would be considered inconceivable today. He used that surplus to pay off the national debt entirely. Again, something totally inconceivable. What was left over was distributed to the state banks. And the state banks were required to funnel those funds down to the cities and towns based proportionately on population. The rift in Scituate was caused by strong differences in opinion over how those funds were to be spent. The problem was that by the time those funds landed in Scituate, the national economic climate had flipped entirely. The Panic of 1837 had set in. And it was a major financial crisis, starting in 1837 and lasting about 7 years. As one historian aptly said, the nation was thrown into turmoil so deep that some observers wondered whether it could survive intact. It was characterized by rampant bank failures. 8 of the 26 state governments defaulted. The United States was frozen out of the financial markets, the international financial markets entirely, and there was unprecedented social and political unrest. Riots were breaking out everywhere. Close to home in Rhode Island, there was a big riot called the Door War. And in Boston, there was a big riot called the Broad Street riot that actually had to be put down with cavalry. On the right, I list some statistics. This is before we had national economic statistics like gross domestic product and inflation, but I think these will give you a sense of the magnitude. Yardage of imported dyed cotton declined 85%. Imported iron and steel manufacturers declined 60%. The average price of cotton in New Orleans down 50%, and so on. Importantly, 40% of the nation's bank capital was completely wiped out. So what caused the Panic of 1837? We start on the left. Before the panic, the country was experiencing rapid economic growth. There were lots of investment opportunities in land and in infrastructure projects as the country was growing westward. And railroads were the internet of the time. They were literally connecting people and places. But with that came rampant, wild speculation. There were very poor lending practices in place among the banks. Then Jackson kills the National Bank. That money goes to the state banks, and the state banks use that to further invest in state infrastructure projects, particularly in the West. And that sparked massive inflation. And there were banks popping up everywhere. In 1830, there were 329 banks. In just 6 years, that number more than doubled to 713. And each bank issued its own form of paper money, banknotes. On a per capita basis, over just a 2-year period, the number of banknotes circulating in the US economy increased 40%. So there was a tremendous amount of money just sloshing around in the economy, fueling this speculation and inflation. Then the pendulum swings the other way, and the panic sets in. Jackson issued what was called the Specie Circular, and that was a requirement that all federal land sales be conducted in only physical gold and silver. Another word for physical gold and silver is specie. So that caused gold to migrate from the eastern banks to the western banks, and it weakened the financial profile of the eastern banks. Compounding the problem was the fact that Britain experienced a very weak harvest. So they had to raise capital in order to import food. They did that by calling in a lot of the loans that they had issued to the banks in the United States. That further weakened the banks in our country. So the banks responded by reserving more and lending less. So overall capital in the economy really started to contract very rapidly. This set off deflation and an overall negative economic spiral. All the while, there was no national bank or independent treasury system in place to govern capital flows. It was literally the Wild West. With that backdrop, and with the country so convulsed, you can imagine that there was pretty strong, heated debate over how to spend that federal surplus in Scituate. The town went back and forth many times over 4 primary options. Should we pay off our debt? Should we lend to the state? Should we invest in mortgages? The option that actually got the most traction and was ultimately implemented was the idea of lending money equally to each resident at a negligible interest rate of 0.9%. It was essentially an interest-free loan, and it was highly, highly controversial. This slide encapsulates the ideological divide that was gripping the nation and Scituate at that time. It's a letter written by Scituate resident Nathaniel Holmes Morrison to his friend in 1839. It reads, "There is a project on foot to divide the town, which will probably take place. The inhabitants, though professing to be Whigs, are locofocos in the most radical sense, and voted at a meeting to divide their portion of the surplus equally among all inhabitants. This has occasioned the division among them and started the project of division." Sounds ominous. So what is a locofoco? The locofocos were the radical wing of the Democratic Party. They were known as the Equal Rights Party. They were for unions, specie, which we know as physical gold and silver-backed money, and in Scituate, they were for the equal distribution of that federal surplus. They were against banks, paper money, financial speculation, and tariffs. The term locofoco comes from the brand of matches that was used when their political opponents turned off the gas lamps at a meeting in New York City. Loco is Spanish for crazy, and foco is derived from fuoco, the Italian word for fire. So this was like another way of calling these people firebrands. And it was said that there was a cell of these locofocos that were living in the eastern part of Scituate. Emerson writes of the locofocos, "The new party is stiff, heady, and rebellious. They are fanatics in freedom. They hate tolls, taxes, turnpikes, banks, hierarchies, governors, yea, almost all laws," end quote. So they were considered radical fanatics. Martin Van Buren was the Democratic president from 1837 to 1841. He was also known as Martin Van Ruin because he inherited the Panic of 1837. He was deeply unpopular and only served one term. But he was a locofoco favorite because he proposed the establishment of an independent treasury system to govern the banks. Here's some fun facts on Van Buren. At 5'6", he's tied as the second shortest president. Madison was first at 5'4". The term OK comes from the nickname of his house in upstate New York, Old Kinderhook. And best of all, Seinfeld's Kramer once had a run-in with the Van Buren Boys street gang. Here's the video. I'm gonna have to do this.
And I noticed that he's not alone. I'm taking on the entire Van Buren boys. Van Buren? There's a street gang named after President Martin Van Buren? Oh yeah, and they're just as mean as he was. I make a move to the door. They block it. So I run to the bathroom. I grab the knob. And they back me up against the cartoon map of Italy. All of a sudden, they just stop.
What happened?
Because I'm still holding the garlic shaker. Like this. I'm only showing 8 fingers. Well, what does that mean? That's their secret sign. Van Buren, he was the 8th president. I thought I was a former Van Beeborg.
Here's me and my wife having some fun at Old Kinderhook last month. On the other side of the political divide was the Whig Party. They were known for meritocracy, to each according to their ability. They most certainly would have chafed at the idea of equal distribution of the federal surplus in Scituate, especially without considering the ability of the individual to repay the loan. The Whigs were also for a national bank, the rule of law, and tariffs. They were against excessive presidential power and manifest destiny. Marshfield's own Daniel Webster was a key founding member of the Whig Party. He was also considered a great orator, having argued many cases in front of the Supreme Court. Webster would have been extremely influential here on the South Shore. Pictured below is Webster's country estate in Marshfield. A key local figure in the Big Split was John King Nash. He owned the general store at 661 Main Street. That circled part of the house is where the general store was located. Daniel Webster was a frequent visitor there. The general store was the most popular meeting place in town. It was also the place where political ideas were debated, often very heatedly. Nash and Webster would have been kindred spirits. Nash was also the town treasurer, and he was aligned with the Whigs on financial matters. He was totally against the equal distribution of the surplus, so much so that he deemed it publicly illegal. Here again is Andy Reardon. This time, he's portraying John King Nash in our cemetery tour. Nash felt so strongly about this that he filed the first petition to separate from Scituate in 1839. A six-man committee was immediately formed to oppose this petition. We have no idea as to why the town opposed his petition. It really is a mystery. But we do know that this particular petition did fail because the split happened much later, 10 years later, in 1849. So it was the idea of equal distribution that was controversial because the actual dollar amount wasn't really all that much. It was $7,444. Today, that equates to about $250,000. On a per capita basis, it's about $70 a person, so what gives? I mean, why all the fuss? Well, maybe we have to look at this not on a per capita basis, but in the aggregate. In the aggregate, that amount would have been about 2.5 times the annual spending budget for schools. And like today, the school budget is the largest line item in the overall budget. So in that sense, it was meaningful. But maybe we shouldn't be thinking about this in a monetary sense at all. Maybe it was the fundamental principle that mattered the most. We really don't know. So we had a few years of significant activity on the split. We'll call that the initial Whig out. Then, inexplicably, the issue went totally dark for 7 years. There's no record of any activity on the split during that time. Then suddenly it picks up. The town reverses course on the surplus and calls in all of those loans that it made to the residents. So Nash and his fellow Whigs were finally having their day. A committee was then formed to consider the expediency of a division of the town, and people were said to be totally obsessed with this once again. There was some opposition. 5 so-called remonstrances were filed. According to Merriam-Webster, a remonstrance is an earnest presentation of reasons for opposition or grievance, especially a document formally stating such points. Most of the complaints in the remonstrances, though, had to do with the placement of the borderline. There were many proposed borderlines, but they didn't differ from each other radically. Importantly, the idea of separation was very popular, despite small differences in opinion on the placement of the line itself. In order to ensure the town line was drawn fairly, a disinterested committee was formed. It consisted of 3 people from 3 neighboring towns: Solomon Lincoln from Hingham, Martin Lincoln from Cohasset, and Moses Rogers from Marshfield. As non-residents, the idea was that these people would be objective And it may sound odd today that we would bring in outsiders to weigh in on such important matters for our town, but it actually did work. There was one particularly disgruntled individual. Paul Dean Briggs lived at 154 Summer Street at the corner of First Parish. One of the proposed border lines cut right through his property, and he was said to be so upset about this that he left a town meeting, rather abruptly. Interestingly, he later skipped town for California gold in the gold rush. He was a 49er. And according to town lore, his section of the road on Summer Street became known as Purgatory. I take it to be neither here nor there, neither Scituate nor South Scituate. Our town was born on Valentine's Day in 1849 when Massachusetts Governor Briggs signed the act into law. Some say that the real date is February 15th, when the state secretary attested the act. But I like the date of the governor's signature, and I think it's kind of cool that it coincides with Valentine's Day. I list the sections of the act. I won't bore you with the details. They delineate, the exact town border and tax responsibilities. But I do want to point out that there was specific mention of the need to care for the poor. As you may know, there was an almshouse located in town at this time. It was located at Town Common, where the Cushing Center currently stands. And after the split, by all means, it was to be maintained. The first town meeting of South Scituate happened on March 5th, 1849. Here's a list of the first officers that were elected. Of note, the three founding members of the Scituate Institution for Savings were among them. They were Ebenezer Thayer Fogg, Samuel Turner, and Anson Robbins. The bank was formed in 1835. It was located at the Town Common where Coastal Heritage Bank currently stands. It survived the Panic of 1837 and many subsequent financial crises through very strong, shrewd financial management. To quote a line from a bank report in 1935, "For 100 years, no depositor in the bank has ever lost $1 of principal or interest," end quote. Deposit growth was strong and steady through that period, averaging 4% a year, which is not too shabby. And as you can see, the bank even experienced deposit growth during the Great Depression. Ebenezer Fogg, like Ebenezer Scrooge, was a banker. But unlike Scrooge, Fogg did appear to have a fun side. The second floor of the bank held what was called Fogg Hall, and that was the place in town where big parties and concerts were held. So the town does have a hard-won reputation for fiscal prudence. Norwell's municipal bond rating is AAA. That's the highest possible level. That means that the rating agencies consider our financial position to be excellent. So I think that Norwell should be awarded the John King Nash Trophy for fiscal prudence. And ironically, you can make an argument that our town's financial position would be even more improved if we reunited with Scituate, because we would share government services. So maybe we should forget the big split and have the big merge.
Yeah.
Before we break for cake, I'd like to share some images of the last big celebration of the big split. In 1999, the 150th anniversary was celebrated at the Cushing Center with a play. In the center photo, we have good friends of the Historical Society, John Bond, seated right there, and Don Spradlin in full costume in the costume shop in Boston. And on the far, far left is Mark Norwell, a descendant of Henry Norwell, and he's playing his part in the play. They also had a cake. Prior to that, a pageant was held at Sherman's Corner in 1936. That would have been the 87th anniversary, which is kind of random, but Sherman's Corner is located at the site of Union Mission Chapel. Again, that's where that perambulation event took place. And the next big celebration of the Big Split will be the bicentennial in 2049. So the next time you wheel your bin down to the street, notice the town seal, and remember that you now know the full story of the Big Split of 1849. This was a fun project. We got to learn some fun words today. I'd like to give special thanks to Wendy Bawabi and Janet Watson for their great help on the content of this presentation, and of course to Zoe Raff for her help in organizing this at the lab.